Hello, everyone. I'm Jonathan Little. Hope you're all having a fantastic day. If you enjoyed the pre-show, let me know. I would appreciate it. Thank you all for letting me know that you could not hear me. I guess my microphone was unplugged or something. Who knows? Everything seems to be good now, though. All right, today we are going to be discussing deep stacked tournament adjustments. A lot of poker players spend a lot of time studying shallow stacked play, where they're playing 25 big blinds deep, or 10 big blinds deep, or 40 big blinds deep. And to be fair, you probably should if you play tournaments, because that's often where you're going to be playing, especially in the later stages. But in the early stages of tournaments, you're usually pretty deep stacked. And also, if you play cash games, you're also usually pretty deep stacked. So we're going to be discussing how you should be adjusting when you are playing deeper stacked today. Let's get right to it. So, first things first. You got to learn how to play all the stacks well, and all the stacks do not play the same. This was actually the premise of my very first book that I wrote. Goodness, I don't even know how long ago. 10 years ago or something like that. A lot of players use the same strategies across the board for all stack depths, and that is a blunder. I'm about to show you, using the GTO solver, how much some of your strategies should change based on your stack depth. So in this webinar today, you're going to learn how to stop making huge errors when you are deep stacked. Also, how to choose the correct continuation betting size when you're deep stacked. You're going to find that quite often you bet tiny and quite often you bet big. And also, we're going to be discussing which hands you actually want to check raise when you are playing deeper stacked. So, we're going to be specifically discussing 75-ish big blind deep play today. If you're deeper, these concepts apply even more. The main difference is that your stack off threshold, which is the amount of equity needed to get all in, is higher as you get deeper and deeper stacked, because essentially you're risking more money, right? As you're risking more and more money, you need stronger and stronger hands to get all the money in. I mean, if you're playing 500 big blinds deep and you have a hand like pocket aces, and let's say there's a raise and a re-raise before the flop, your opponent calls, the flop comes. If they want to check raise you and get all the money in for 500 big blinds, well, your aces are probably not very good, right? That's a good example of where your stack off threshold goes up substantially. Now, at 75 big blinds deep, you're going to find that the stack off threshold is decently higher than when you're playing 40 big blinds deep, and especially if you're playing really shallow. Like if you're playing 15 big blinds deep, if somebody raises and you call on the big blind and you make a pair, you're just not folding, right? But whenever you're playing deep stack and you make a pair, well, we have a marginal bluff catcher that you may end up having to fold by the river. Also, as you get deeper and deeper, position becomes even more important, because you get to decide if you put in another raise or bet when you are in position. You're also going to find that the concept of nut advantage, who has more effective nut hands in their range, either you or your opponent, really drives your strategy and essentially makes the nut hands go way up in value, because when you have the nuts or the effective nuts, you can win a ton of money, right? And you're going to find that nearly all strategic adjustments discussed here today in this webinar are going to be derived from these 3 points, and these 3 points are the main ideas that really make you adjust your strategy as you get deeper and deeper stacked. So we're going to discuss the nut advantage effects on deep stacked strategy. Like I said, as stacks increase, your stack off threshold increases. Again, the stack off threshold is the point at which a hand becomes strong enough that you're just happy playing for all the money. Okay? And essentially, the stack off threshold determines what type of hands count as part of your nut advantage, right? Like I said, if you're 500 big blinds deep, even a hand like pocket aces is not the nuts if your opponent wants to get all the money in. Whereas if you're playing 30 big blinds deep, pocket aces is the nuts. And you're very happy to get all the money in. So essentially, the deeper and deeper stacked you are, the more nutted or the more premium hand you need in order to get in. You never heard the term stack off threshold before? Yeah, I mean, stack off threshold is the idea of where's the cutoff of hands that are good enough to get in. Okay, so strategically, this concept forces you to use nut advantage to really determine continuation bet frequency and size. That's going to be a very, very heavy driver if you're betting frequently or infrequently, and also small or large. The lower the frequency, you're generally going to have lower frequencies of lines that put a lot of money in the pot when you're playing deeper stacked. You're not going to be check raising quite as often when you're deep. You're not going to be barreling the turn or bluffing the river quite as often when you're deep most of the time, because you're risking a ton more money. if you bluff the river and you're only betting half pot and it fails, it's not that big of a deal. But if you bluff the river and you risk all your money and it's 2x pot or something and it fails, it's costly, right? But in general, you're going to find that you don't get to go bet jam as often when you are deep. You're also going to want to play substantially more polarized strategies, especially on the turn and the river, because again, hands like top pair second kicker are not good enough to bet the flop, bet the turn, and jam the river when you're playing 200 big blinds deep, right? And essentially, you're going to end up value betting less thinly. So as you're value betting less thinly, you don't get to bluff as often in turn, right? So as you're value betting less often, you have to bluff less often. And therefore, you don't get to bet as often because stack-off threshold goes way up. Okay? So let's take a look at a situation. This is using Pio Solver. In this scenario, we're going to look at how to play 40 big blinds deep and how to play 75 big blinds deep. So in this scenario, we raise the low jack and the big blind calls. Okay? We raise low jack, big blind calls, flop comes 8-5-4 with a flush draw. This is a very coordinated board that's not particularly good for our low jack range. We do have some very strong hands, but the big blind callers have a lot of very good hands in this scenario. So 40 big blinds deep, you see the GTO strategy, either checks or bet 60% pot, and at 60% pot bet size is used with decently strong value hands, right? So we see hands like maybe queen 8 and better are betting to get in. So essentially, the stack-off threshold here is going to be something like an 8 or better, maybe a good 7 or better, whenever you're playing with a stack depth. But you get to bet bigger in this scenario because 40 big blinds deep, a hand like aces or 9s or 10s, these hands are the effective nuts, even though you could be beat, right? They count as essentially the nut hands, okay? And a lot of people in these scenarios think, because they've only studied shallow stack poker, that on these coordinated boards, they should be betting, kind of infrequently, but when they bet big. And that is true when you're playing shallower stacked because hands like pocket 10s are almost always good. But if you bet small and your opponent calls, you're going to end up getting outdrawn, et cetera, right? That said, take a look at the strategy on the right, playing 75 big blinds deep. Now we're checking a whole lot more. So this is a spot where we have to check substantially more often. And this is because we don't have a big range advantage to begin with. Notice our equity is roughly the same in these scenarios, actually a little bit higher over here. But now the stack-off threshold is substantially higher. So while you're still going to end up playing a big pot with hands like pocket 9s or ace 8, you don't have... Essentially, those hands are weaker across the board, right? Like if you have ace 8 on 8-5-4 and your opponent wants to get in for 40 big blinds, then you just get in with ace 8, right? But that's not necessarily going to be the case whenever you have 75 big blinds deep. You have to be a little more cautious because if your opponent wants to load in 75 big blinds on this board, you're probably not in great shape. And now the effective nut hands are stronger, and we, in our range, don't actually have a whole lot of them. Notice in this scenario, we have the range advantage by a little bit, but we really lack the nut advantage. When you think about what the actual nuts are in 8-5-4 that you want to get your money in with, it's going to be 7-6, which we don't really have so much. Also 8s, 5s, and 4s, which we of course have, but so does the opponent. And then lots of high equity draws, and we don't really have a whole lot of high equity straight and flush draws. I mean, we have some, but not a lot. So the question is, are we betting smaller for pot control? No, the solver doesn't really have this idea of pot control. It's more of how does our range fare against our opponent's range. And in this scenario, we don't really have a big range advantage, so we're not going to be betting all that often. And we don't have a nut advantage, so we're going to be betting small. And that's it. That you're going to find that very often is the case. When you don't have a range advantage and you don't have a nut advantage, you don't bet all that frequently. And when you do bet, you usually bet small, even on these relatively coordinated boards. Okay? And we're going to see in just a second, when you have the range advantage and you have the nut advantage, you bet frequently, very often using a bigger size. But in this spot, the main takeaway is that 40 big blinds deep, you actually do have a lot of effective nut hands, like overpairs, that are happy getting it in for 40 big blinds. So essentially our effective nut range is bigger, 40 big blinds deep compared to 75 big blinds deep, even though our ranges are very close to similar, because even overpairs are not loving it in this scenario. Okay? So equities are roughly the same, but the nuts in our range have been decreased because of the stack-off threshold. And if we were even deeper and deeper stacked, you'd most likely see even more checks in this scenario. Okay, let's take a look at another scenario. Now, we raise low jack, big blind calls. Flop comes queen, 8, 5. Yeah, okay, making sure I have these charts lined up right. All right, so in this scenario, we have the range advantage and we have the nut advantage now, right? So because we have the range advantage and because we have the nut advantage, now we are going to bet pretty frequently and usually using a bigger size. This board's also kind of draw heavy. Anytime there's no straight on the flop available, but there are straight draws, you're usually going to find those are the times where you're going to be using a bigger bet size, especially if your opponent would have had straights in their range, right? So if I had to imagine, if this board was instead something like 9-5-4, we'd probably see some bigger bet sizes in this range. But because there's already some super duper nut hands that are not vulnerable to being outdrawn, like straights that your opponent could have, you just don't get to bet very big. All right, so anyway, on queen 8-5, now we see big frequent bets from both bet sizes because now hands like a queen are just very, very good to get money in on the flop, right? So this is a spot where we are very happy just loading money in with our good queens and better. And we see, because of that, we get to bet very, very frequently. Does that same concept apply for flush draws? If there is a flush draw on board, you don't necessarily see the same pattern. Typically, though, if there's 3 cards to a flush on the board, that's usually a time where you do bet tiny. So that concept does apply. Essentially, as they're more like super duper nut hands that your opponent could potentially have, even if you could have some of them too, you often go for the small bet size in general. Actually, I have an advanced tournament course coming out at pokercoaching.com very, very soon. And we discuss how to play those specific boards where there's 3 cards to a flush. And we do discuss the differences between when there's a straight available already and when there's a straight draw available. And you'll find that whenever there's a straight draw available, that's usually when you use bigger sizes when you have the nut advantage. So as you see here, we're playing both of these spots relatively similarly. Also notice we're potting it on the queen 8-5 flop, playing 75 big blinds deep. We're also potting it most of the time, playing 40 big blinds deep. This is a spot where a lot of people just make a small continuation bet. And that's a problem, because you see here, the small continuation bet, especially when we're deep stacked, is just not used very often at all. Okay? Now, let's discuss a situation where we are going to consider check raising. Now, the button raises we call in the big blind. Notice these ranges are going to be different because 40 big blinds deep, you're re-raising with a different range than when you're playing 75 big blinds deep. If you have the Poker Coaching app, you can pull up these charts and you can see these ranges. Okay, so button raises we call big blind. Flop comes ace, jack, 5. This is a terrible flop for the big blind, right? Because if you look at the big blind's range, they don't have any of the good aces because they would have re-raised them before the flop. That's going to be the case in both scenarios. So this is a spot where we completely lack the range advantage. Notice we have about 39 to 41% equity here, okay? So this is a very bad spot for us. But take a look at how the stack-off threshold applies. You're going to find that as you start getting relatively shallow stack, like 40 big blinds or shallower, you almost always check raise with your best top pairs. Pretty much always. So in this scenario, our best top pairs, not counting 2 pairs, are going to be ace-10, and ace-9, and ace-8. And we see ace-10, ace-9, and ace-8 check raising a decent chunk of the time, okay? But that's not the case when you're deep stacked. As you get deeper, your best top pairs do not necessarily check raise, especially if you don't have all that many obvious draws that want to be check raising, and also as you don't have additional other nut hands in your range. Some people are confused about the spot. In this scenario, the button raises pre-flop. We call the big blind. Flop comes ace, jack, 5, 2 spades. We check, and they continuation bet small, 25% pot, which is 1.5 big blinds, as they should. Okay? So take a look at this, though. We're check raising 13% of the time, 40 big blinds deep, but we're check raising only 7% of the time, 75 big blinds deep. Not all that often, right? When we do check raise 75 big blinds deep, we're going to be very, very polarized, right? Like as I said before, whenever you are deeper stacked, you check raise more polarized and less for, let's call it thin-ish value, like ace-8, 40 big blinds deep. Feels kind of gross to get in here to me, but you do. When you're playing 40 big blinds deep, you definitely don't want to be doing that when you're playing 75 big blinds deep. So you see, we're only check raising for value with 2 pair and better, maybe a tiny sliver of ace-10 and ace-9, but these are negligible, right? And then draws. So what are our high equity draws that are almost never good in this scenario? Well, it's going to be gut shot straight draws that lack showdown value and flush draws. So we see 4-3, 4-2, and 3-2 for gut shots check raise this scenario very frequently. We also see slivers of flush draws across the board check raising, right? So we're check raising deep stacked with usually very high equity draws and some rather junky draws with stuff like gut shots. That way, when you check raise, your opponents won't know if you have 2 pair or better, which is very good to get in, or some junky draw, right? And that puts them in a really, really nasty spot. As we are playing shallower stack, though, you see we're check raising more often for value, right? So we're check raising more often for value, and that allows us to check raise more often as a bluff, including more flush draws, and also more logical bluffs. And logical bluffs in this scenario, and in a lot of scenarios like this, are usually going to be bottom pairs with junky kickers. So we see in this scenario 5-4 and 5-3 and 6-5 and 7-5 do some check raising, because when you check raise and get called, you usually have 5 pretty clean outs. Okay? So this is a spot where I think a lot of people mess up one way or the other. I actually think a lot of people probably play the 75 big blind spot pretty well here because they just do a lot of folding, as they should. But I do think 40 big blinds deep in this scenario, most people don't check raise wide enough. They don't check raise ace 10 and ace 9 here with the idea of just getting it in. Okay? Justin says, Jack 5 suited, sporadically check, rips it all in. Yeah. So whenever you do look at the GTO solver in spots like this, you want to make sure you don't get too bogged down with the idea of it makes this play some tiny frequency of the time. Yeah, it does, but at the same time, it's going to be very difficult to implement exactly that. And like, if you look at this chart, I'm not even seeing the bluffs, which means the bluffs are probably like tiny, tiny slivers of flush draws, if I had to guess. I mean, I don't even know. I don't even know. And in spots like this, you can essentially ignore these scenarios. Let's take a look at one more spot here. So now, this is a different scenario. It comes Jack 5-2. Also, a really bad board for the big blind, right? This is another very bad board for the big blind. Also, low jack raised, and we called. So now their range is going to be decently strong as well. So, low jack raises, we call big blind. We check Jack 5-2 with no flush draw. They bet small. It's back to us. Now we actually have a lot of top pairs. So in the previous example, we didn't have any of the best top pairs. So most of our top pairs were actually not in that great a shape. Here, though, we have ace jack, king jack, queen jack, right? We have all the good top pairs on Jack 5-2. So even though we completely lack the range advantage, we have roughly the same equities in the previous spot. Now we have more effective nut hands, right? So as we have more effective nut hands, we get to check raise more often as a bluff. It's kind of hard to find bluffs on the Jack 5-2, though, right? So again, usually your draws are going to end up being stuff like gut shots, and on boards like this, it's going to be cards with an overcard to the jack, like a king or a queen quite often. So let's take a look and confirm this. So we have, looks like Jack 9 and better can check raise. Notice various sizes, check raise kind of big, check raise kind of medium, whatever. You know, we're still check raising. You're going to find your best top pairs usually like to check raise kind of big. We're also going to be check raising with gut shots. So let's go down here, look at 4-3, 4-2, and 3-2. No, 4-3. 4-3 is open-ended. So yeah, 4-3 is going to check raise a lot. Also 6-4 and 6-3. Kind of interesting to see 6-3 does not, but 6-4 does. Sure. Looks like random 5-4 and 5-3 check raise. Those are probably going to be pretty easy ones to miss. And then also we're going to be check raising with obvious, the other obvious gut shots of ace-4 and ace-3 a large chunk of the time, right? So is that enough bluffs? Turns out it's not, because we are actually getting to check raise this flop pretty frequently, so we get to find additional bluffs. And you're going to find that these additional bluffs usually have an overcard to the jack and some sort of backdoor draw, like a backdoor flush draw or a backdoor straight draw, or ideally both. So notice here, we have hands like king 4, king 3, queen 4, and queen 3. Also king 6 and queen 6, going for the check raise 40 big blinds deep. And that's because they have backdoor flush draw and they have backdoor straight draw. We're also going to see probably queen 10 and queen 9. It's like random one overcard with backdoor straight draws as well. So we see those check raise a decent chunk of the time too. Notice king queen mostly calls because king queen has 2 overcards. It's just a slightly better hand, right? It has 6 outs to improve if your opponent happens to have a jack, whereas the others do not. So we're essentially check raising with our best made hands, high equity draws, and some low equity draws. And you're going to find that's almost always what you're going to be doing in this scenario. And as you check raise wider for value, you get to check raise wider with bluffs, right? So in this scenario, 40 big blinds deep per check raising about 20% of the time, 75 big blinds deep per check raising a little bit less often again, right? It's always going to be the case. Whenever you check raise, you're almost always check raising less often deep compared to when you are shallow. Okay? So this is a scenario where now let's take a look at what this strategy is doing. We know it's going to still check raise with the best top pairs because ace jack and king jack are pretty great, but let's see how wide it actually does go. So it looks like it's stopping at something like queen jack for the most part. So it looks like queen jack and better can check raise, but you really don't have all that many combinations of those. We do have sets, right? We do have 2 pairs, so we do have a lot of those hands, but that's about it. So in this scenario, we're going to check raise with the 4-3. Again, check raise is a decent chunk of the time. Gut shots raise a decent chunk of the time, right? So we have ace 4, ace 3, 6-4, 6-3 sometimes. Again, some people commenting in the chat that 6-3 doesn't really check raise all that often. It doesn't, and this is why poker's hard. You got to mix it up, right? You got to mix it up, and it turns out from out of position, you do a whole lot of mixing it up. But you want to look for patterns, right? It's important to look for patterns in these scenarios because I'm not necessarily trying to teach you to memorize this chart. I'm not telling you to memorize this chart. I'm telling you to find the patterns that reoccur over and over so that you can extrapolate from this spot to other common spots, right? I think a lot of people get bogged down when looking at GTO solutions and they think, oh man, how am I ever going to memorize this? And the answer is you're not. But you know in this scenario, all right, I have the best top pair top kickers. They're pretty good hands, and therefore I get to check raise those. Whereas on the ace jack 5 board we looked at a second ago, you don't have the best top pairs, and therefore you don't get to check raise all that often, right? So this is a spot where we also have to find some additional bluffs, and it looks like the additional bluffs are again going to come from king 6, queen 6, king 4, queen 4, king 3, queen 3, and queen 10 and queen 9 suiteds, right? Essentially backdoor flush draw with some sort of backdoor straight draw with an overcard, ideally. Looks like king queen check raises in this spot a little bit more often. It's not that big of a deal, but worth noting, right? So this is a spot I think a lot of people don't check raise nearly often enough. So I think in the previous example on ace jack 5, I think people probably check raise pretty close to right 75 big blinds deep, where they just check raise with their best hands and obvious draws. But on jack 5-2, I think most people don't check raise nearly often enough. I bet most people here don't check raise the queen 4 with backdoor flush draw most of the time in the spot, but you should. This is something I learned, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago whenever I first started looking at these scenarios, and you're going to find that you get away with your check raises a lot in this spot. Okay? Text says that exploitatively, you have been check raising very wide in small stakes games because people continuation bet the flop too much, and then presumably they overfold a little bit too much because they probably think that you have the nuts, which, you know, that's usually right. Most people are going to think you have the nuts in these scenarios. And if that's the case, you should be check raising even more often. So now maybe even take stuff like, I don't even know, king 7 suited, queen 7 suited, all the queen 9 suiteds, right? Maybe even something like queen 8 suited. All of those types of hands become very reasonable check raises because when you get called, usually your overcard is live. Also, your backdoor straight and your backdoor flush are usually very live. Okay? How do you decide when the sometimes is? So look, what I try to do is I try to first exploit whatever the opponent's doing wrong. You got to realize that you're very rarely going to even necessarily want to play the GTO strategy unless your opponent's also trying to play as close to the GTO strategy as they can. So first things first, if they're continuation betting too often, like Tex says his opponents do, I would check raise with more bluffs across the board. So all these hands that are using mixed frequencies, like notice king 6 suited here, check raises, it looks like half the time. Then the other 25% of the time, whenever it has backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw, it calls. It folds when it does not have the backdoor flush draw. So maybe I check raise those every time, right? If I think my opponent's continuation betting too tightly, which most people don't do on the jack 5-2, most people just bet every time. But if they're continuation betting too tightly, say they're only betting with their best hands, and you want to be check raising with your bluffs way less often, perhaps none, right? You may also want to check raise for value a little bit less often too, because their range is not quite so wide. But I mean, look, and if you're trying to be in the spot and try to actually mix it up, you can do things like being aware of the second timer on your watch or the tournament clock, or be aware that perhaps you've been on the passive side for the last hour or so. So maybe this is the time where you just go ahead and put in the raise with all of the raising hands, or maybe it's the opposite against your particular opponent, etc., etc. Do you bet most of the turns after you check raise the flop? It depends on how strong your range is. As your range is more and more polarized on the flop to check raise, you get to bet the turn more and more often. That said, I have to presume in these scenarios, like this particular scenario, you're probably giving up when you don't turn. Well, you're giving up with your backdoor flush draws and overcards the times where some of them turn equity and some of them don't turn equity, right? So whenever the ones, say the turn's a 3 of hearts, right? Putting up a straight draw and flush draw, right? If you pair your 3, you're probably going to be checking. If you have, like, say king, say you have queen 10. Queen 10 turned nothing, so that's probably going to be a hand that checks. Whereas the king 6 and the king 4 will definitely keep betting. All those will keep betting. So essentially, you're going to, when some of the draws come in, you're going to be continuing to bet with the draws that improved and usually giving up on the ones that don't. You're also going to make sure you're checking some of your weakest value hands that check raised to help protect your checking range, right? When none of the draws come in, meaning all of these backdoor draws is completely brick, like say the turn's a 8 of, say it's a 7. A 7 is a pretty brick card for us, right? Say the turn's a random 7 of diamonds. In that scenario, you're gonna have to find some draws to keep bluffing. Fortunately, you have gut shots some portion of the time. Some of you are surprised to see 2 pairs and sets check calling some portion of the time. Well, 40 big blinds deep, if you take a look at pocket 5s and pocket 2s, they actually do check call some decent frequency. Same thing with jack 2. And that's because you really, really, really want to strengthen your check calling range so that you can check raise these on later betting rounds. And also so that you can check call wider. You're going to find that from out of position, you pretty much always check call with some strong hands, right? So you're going to find that's the case. You usually want to check call the hands that are least likely to get outdrawn. It is neat to see like jack 5 check raising every time and jack 2 check raising almost never. Why does the solver do it? I don't know. Solver mixes it up. Usually has to do with your opponent's range and the way various blockers and unblockers line up. Same thing for 6-4 and 6-3, right? Notice 6-4 and 6-3 are both gut shots. They both are, in my mind, effectively the same hand, yet solver check raises one very frequently and one very infrequently. And you're going to find that in different spots, based on slight differences in the way the ranges line up, you may check raise them both every time, right? So again, don't get too bogged down in this idea, but look at the hands that really like to check raise, and also look at the hands that really don't like to check raise. For example, look at a hand like Jack 7, right? Jack 7, Jack 6, Jack 4, Jack 3. Top pair, no kicker. These hands don't check raise very often at all in either scenario, right? Because they are almost always good, but due to stack off threshold, you don't get to check raise quite as often. Also notice ace high that does not have any backdoor draws, does not check raise very often at all, right? Notice some hands with no draw at all, like king 9 for random overcard and 10-8 for random undercards. These hands always check fold, right? So keep that kind of thing in mind. I think that's definitely relevant. Again, the main idea is not memorize the chart and do exactly what it says every time, because the chart's going to be all over the place. But you want to take the general concepts and make sure you're applying those in your own game. So again, let's go back to these main topics we discussed. The nut advantage determines continuation bet frequency and size, right? Very, very important. We saw on this 8-5-4 board, 75 big blinds deep, you don't bet all that often, and when you bet, you usually bet small because we don't have a big range advantage and we don't have the nut advantage, right? When you lack the range advantage and the nut advantage, you bet pretty infrequently, okay? And we see on the queen 8-5, when we have the range advantage and we have the nut advantage, we're usually betting big and frequently, especially when the board is what's referred to as dynamic, meaning the board is likely to change on the turn such that the effective nuts on the flop could become weaker on the turn. Okay, those are going to be times where you usually bet using a big size. You're going to find that you take lower frequencies of aggressive lines in general, like check raising, right? We saw in both of these examples. On ace jack 5, you check raise way less often because we completely lack the nut advantage in the big blind. We saw on the jack 5-2, we have more nuts, but we're still not check raising quite as often, 75 big blinds deep as 40, right? So that pattern is going to hold true basically every time. You're going to be using much more polarized strategies, especially on turns and river. I know we didn't discuss the turns and rivers, but you're going to find that like I said, whenever you check raise flop with a good strong range, you're going to keep betting a lot of it on the turn because those hands are usually very, very good. But as your check raising range on the flop gets weaker and weaker, you in turn have to bet the turn less often, right? Because of stack off threshold. And also, you just in general value bet less thinly. I mean, I think this is probably a pretty good example of this one, where on 8-5-4, we see, if we take a look at hands like, let me look at most of our 8s in this scenario, right? Our 8s are not really betting all that often. I mean, to be fair, I guess these strategies kind of line up, to be fair, but we're using smaller bet sizes. And we're just, if you look at like all frequencies across the board, they're just a little bit lower, right? So like take a look at ace 8, right? Ace 8 bets effectively every time 75 big blinds deep, but it actually does bet 100% of the time, 40 big blinds deep. Same thing for king 8, right? They both bet pretty often, but every single time when you're playing shallower stacked. So if you look at just all these frequencies, they are generally bumped up a little bit, 40 big blinds deep compared to 75, because again, stack off threshold and nut advantage. Take a look at like 8-7, right? 8-7 bets usually, but not always, 75 big blinds deep, but every time 40 big blinds deep. Also, again, smaller size. I cannot emphasize this more. When you lack the range advantage and when you lack the nut advantage, when you're deep stacked, you have to use small bets. This is something I messed up for a long time. It's something everybody messed up for a long time. A lot of people mess it up today. A lot of people think when they're deeper stacked, they have to bet bigger. They usually bet tighter ranges correctly, but they use bigger sizes when they bet, using the idea that, all right, I'm probably pretty polarized here. But on a board like 8-5-4, you just don't have very many nuts. And even the hand like aces is not thrilled to get it in. Notice how often aces checks in this spot, by the way. You're checking with aces and kings and queens in this scenario because you want to protect the rest of your checking range in this spot. You're not necessarily checking because you're scared of getting your money in with aces, but you're checking because if you look at the rest of your checking range, it's kind of garbage, right? I mean, look at the checking range in these scenarios. It's a bunch of ace highs, king highs, queen highs, jack highs. It's a pretty bad range, right? So whenever you have a very weak checking range, you have to make sure you're protecting it by putting some strong hands in that checking range. Okay? Text is amazing how relatively easy so many spots become once you have principles. It's true. It's definitely true. I mean, as you have a better understanding of just like, essentially call them rules in your head. I mean, obviously these rules are going to get broken frequently, but as you have ideas and heuristics of ways to play common spots, it works very, very well for you. They want to discuss why we're betting 10s more often than aces. 10s and 9s are almost always good, but vulnerable. You're going to find that hands that are almost always good, but the most vulnerable, usually bet more often than hands that are almost always good and less vulnerable. Okay, so in this scenario, like we see, 9s and 10s betting every time, 40 big blinds deep, whereas aces and kings don't bet as often. Right? Same thing when we're shallower stacked. Notice that 9s and 10s bet, not every time, but like half the time, whereas aces bets almost never, because aces is almost always good, but unlikely to get outdrawn. Okay? Fun stuff. If you want to learn more, you can actually go check out pokercoaching.com premium for free from November 9th to, oh, hello. I'm doing a webinar right now. I'll talk to you in a little bit. Go on.
I'll put it up there.
No, okay. Thomas wants his goldfish right here. Okay. See you in a bit. You can try Poker Coaching Premium for free. It costs you $0. It will cost you your email address. You do have to log in somehow. Some people say it's not really free because you have to give your email address. Well, sorry. Have to give you a way to log in somehow. Anyway, check out pokercoaching.com/5-day pass from November 9th to 13th, and you'll be able to have complete full access to the entire site. We have over 650 classes where we teach you about specific poker topics and over 1,700 hand quizzes from my world-class group of pros. They have over $75 million in live tournament earnings, probably even more than that at this point, and they've been crushing it. We actually have a brand new course that I have learned a lot from myself. It's called How to Bink Tournaments with Brock Wilson and Rampage Poker. Brock Wilson is one of the absolute best tournament poker players in the world, also an excellent cash game player. And he has been coaching Rampage Poker for tournaments. And funny enough, after their very first session, Rampage won a tournament. He literally won a tournament like 3 days later. It's amazing. So they've been studying together and recording their study sessions together. And you can go watch those. Again, it's completely free. from November 9th to 13th. Make sure you check it out. Also, you have free access to all these multi-part series that we have at pokercoaching.com. We have a series by Brock Wilson that came out just recently. It's crushing high-stakes tournaments. He absolutely crushes them. We have a new course here by Aram on how to make deep runs in large field tournaments. He makes deep runs in the World Series main event frequently. He's final tabled it, and he discusses that. We have a new course as well by Jonathan Jaffe, one of my absolute favorite poker players. He gets in there, he battles, and he discusses how to get in there and battle in tough cash games. And also, J-Win Poker, another new coach at pokercoaching.com who started off as a poker coaching student. I actually saw him using our pre-flop charts. I reached out and he said, oh yeah, I love poker coaching. Now, he's been crushing it. He's one of our coaches. He has a brand new multi-part series on beating loose live cash games, which are his areas of specialty. Specialty? We also have over 650 classes, like I said, on all sorts of topics. Whatever you want to learn about, click it in the search bar. If you want to learn about bluffing, type bluffing. You want to learn about turn check raising, type turn check raising. Whatever you want to learn, type it there, and you'll probably have a class on it. And if there's not a class on it, send me an email, and I'll make a class on it. Simple as that. Like I said, you'll have free access to over 1,700 quizzes. These are interactive quizzes where essentially you are put in a poker scenario before the flop, and you have to decide what you do. Say everybody folds to you in the cutoff, and you have some particular hand. Say a base jack. Do you fold, call, raise small, or raise big? You have to say what you do. Then you get feedback. Then, let's say the big blind calls, flop comes, whatever. Jack 5-2. Sound familiar? Opponent checks. You have to decide. Should you check, bet small, bet medium, or bet big? And we already know the right answer because we just went through it, right? So you probably click the right answer, and then you will get feedback again. Say the opponent check raises you. What do you do then, right? So you're getting feedback as if you were playing poker hands at the table and getting feedback from your coach in real time. It's very, very valuable. I've learned a lot from him. Here's J-Win, poker coaching success story. In short, one of his students fixed their pre-flop game, their bet sizing, and their calling parameters. Also, they stepped down in stakes. There's a lot of value to stepping down in stakes, right? Step down in stakes, learn to play better, and you will start winning. Who'd have thought? This player here said that they were not doing very well. They're completely bust. They pulled $1,000 out, devoted themselves to poker, and now they have about a $10,000 bankroll again. Good job, good work. Poker is an excellent way to get a hold of a lot of money kind of slowly. I hate to break it to you. I know a lot of people want to get rich quick. They want to bink a tournament right off the bat. But you got to realize that there's a lot of variance when you try to do this thing. If you just sit down and play cash games, you can grind up a bankroll consistently. I mean, I used to sit at Bellagio at 5, 10, and 10, 20, no limit, all day, every day, for like a year and a half. And I had a very good win rate, grinded up consistent money, and it was nice. It was a grind. It was a slog. I would not even necessarily say it was the most fun I've ever had in my life, but I made a bunch of money. And, if you want to make a bunch of money, then getting good at poker is definitely a way to go about it. So anyway, our coaches are crushing it. Our students are crushing it. And now it is your turn. Make sure you check out pokercoaching.com/5-day pass. You will have complete, full access to the entire site, all of it. Someone asked if you'll have access to the pre-flop quiz, pre-flop charts. Yes, you'll have access to everything from November 9th to the 13th. Mark your calendars. Everybody go do it. Mark your calendars right now and make sure you take advantage of it. I'm perfectly happy for you to go binge the site, get full value from all the content, learn a ton, and crush the games. You may ask, why would you give it away for free? To be fair, I know that if you go and you try poker coaching, you're going to learn a lot. You are. You're going to learn a lot. And you're going to want to keep learning more because it turns out whenever you improve your poker skills substantially, you get better at the game. Poker becomes more fun. It's more fun when you win. Who'd have thought? And hopefully, I'm going to teach you some things that let you make some money. And hopefully, after you've made a decent chunk of money, you'll come back and become a poker coaching member, continue studying, continue improving, make more money, and continue crushing the games indefinitely. So make sure you check it out. pokercoaching.com/5-day pass. Take advantage of it. Please, please, please take advantage of it. That's me it for today. Hope you enjoyed today's show. If you did, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe buttons down below. If you have any comments, feedback, suggestions, please let me know. Also, we have an advanced tournament course coming out very soon. We've been, I've spent many hours getting this thing together, featuring all sorts of content from many of our coaches. We have some content by Brock Wilson on ICM scenarios, final table payouts. We also have content by Jonathan Jaffe on heads up poker. We have content by Justin Saliba. Where's Justin Saliba? Is he on here? Is my brain broken? Oh, here's Justin right in the middle. Justin Saliba has content as well on, he actually plays a bunch of heads up against Jonathan Jaffe, the crusher, and then they go back and they discuss it together. Justin also helped get together lots of the GTO solutions for my sections. My sections are primarily dealing with when you should be using very tiny bet sizes, when you should be using very big bet sizes, and also various stack depths adjustments, because you want to make sure you are playing adequately. And I have an entire section on how to play deeper stacked poker. So make sure you check that out. That's going to be it for today. Good luck. Have fun. Thanks again for being here. Hope you can tell I have lots of passion for poker coaching and for helping all of you improve at poker. And I just want all of you to succeed and to crush it. Check it out, pokercoaching.com/5-day pass. That'll be available from the 9th to the 13th of November, 2022. Good luck. Have fun. Have a great day. Hope you make the most of your week, the rest of the week, I guess. And I'll talk to all of you next time. Bye-bye.